Views expressed on this program are those of the hosts, guests, and callers, and are not necessarily those of this station, its management, or other advertisers. You're listening to Transformation Talk Radio.
Welcome to Cultural Brilliance Radio, the DNA of organizational excellence with Claudette Rowley. Conversations that are transforming the world of culture and business. Claudette brings fresh, innovative perspectives that push the boundaries of what organizational cultures can and should be. Learn how to catalyze your organization's workforce into an authentic, intentional, and financially successful culture. Now here's your host, Claudette Rowley.
Hey everybody, I'm Claudette Rowley, and you are listening to Cultural Brilliance, the DNA of organizational excellence on Transformation Talk Radio. Stay with us for the next hour and let us help you experience some groundbreaking ways to transform your company's culture. Twice each month, we have some of the foremost experts on organizational culture, leadership, and change, helping you understand how to make a brilliant culture the rule rather than the exception. Today, I'm really excited about our guest. He is a colleague and friend of mine, John McGuire from the Center for Creative Leadership. And John and I are going to be talking about how to transform your leadership culture. But before we get into that, let me tell you a little bit about John and his background. As I mentioned, John is a senior fellow and practice leader at the Center for Creative Leadership in Colorado Springs. He's also the author of a really great book called Transforming Your Leadership Culture. And we'll be talking about some of the ideas in the book today and some of the practices that he uses with clients at the Center for Creative Leadership. One of the things that's incredibly interesting about John is this is his third career. Yes, he started out in the therapy field. Then he moved into a long career on the business side of things, working for companies like the Digital Equipment Corporation, Fidelity Investments, and held many senior business management positions in both companies. So he has a lot of experience there in seeing, what really works in organizations and what doesn't. And then he moved into this third career, working for the past 20 years at the Center in Organizational Development and Leadership. He also helped co-found the Center for Creative Leadership's organizational leadership and transformation practice, bringing that into the fold. Welcome, John.
Thank you, Claudette. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Oh, the pleasure is mine. I'm sure we're going to have a really great conversation today. And and I'm glad you're here. I know the culture and organizations and leadership and change, anything in those areas is something we both are near and dear to both of our hearts, right?
Absolutely right. I think we've been on the same path for a long time. It's an exciting place to be.
It is. So, the place I'd love to start is just by having you share with listeners, when we say leadership culture, what are we talking about? What do we really mean by that?
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's at this point in time, the term leadership culture is mostly intuitive, and we mean it that way. One of the things that's interesting to me about organizational change and culture and the work that we're in is that it's all pretty new. The fact of the matter is that at the turn of the century, not quite 20 years ago now, nobody thought that culture was a feasible lever for change. Everybody knew that it was important. Everybody knew that it was kind of mysterious, but nobody knew how to use it. And so at CCL, about 10 years ago, we redefined leadership. We wrote a seminal article. It's a good piece. It's highly referenced. The name of the article is Direction, Alignment, Commitment. We wrote it in the Leadership Quarterly. And in that, there's a framework. We just call it DAC for short, DAC for short. And in that DAC framework, we posit that in this model, the direction, alignment, commitment is the result of leadership. That's what leaders do together, is create direction, alignment, and commitment. It's a bit of a definition. It's a bit of a stake in the ground around, when we started this, there were 180 different definitions of leadership. We landed on something that's more than just a definition. It's really a point of view. It's really a philosophy. If direction, alignment, and commitment, when direction, alignment, and commitment is being made in any organization at any time, there's a collection of leaders doing it together. It's leadership that's happening. Mm-hmm. And that's leadership in the collective. And that collective automatically puts you in the culture. So it's the leadership culture which determines the kind of direction, alignment, and commitment that you get. So leadership culture is the driver or the operating system of this DAC, this leadership. And what's important about that is that we define leadership culture as really just two things. It's not as big as organization culture. It's not as big as culture ethnically or even globally. By leadership culture, we mean very specifically the beliefs and practices that create direction, alignment, and commitment. Mm. So why is this important? Why are beliefs and practices important? I think it's important for one really important reason, and that is that so much of change work is driven by this idea that we're going to change behaviors. The problem with that is that people don't want to change their behaviors unless they change their beliefs. As human beings, we're decision makers. We get really good at what we do. We get really good at the decisions that we make. We become experts and we start to trust these automatic decisions. So we make decisions all the time without ever thinking about the nature of those decisions. And what's happened is that in organizations with their cultures, they can be very successful for a long time, and then things change. The market shifts. A requirement for a business model shift happens. And what that means is that the old beliefs don't work anymore. You got to get some new beliefs. So that's what we mean by leadership culture. It's the beliefs and practices that drive direction, alignment, commitment, or drive leadership. Does that make sense?
Oh, it completely does. Yeah. And thank you for sharing that. I think that's such a, it's so important, I think, for, as you were saying, for us to understand that, leadership culture is this operating system. It's not just a how-to, right? It sounds like it's a way of being in an organization as a leader.
It is. Everybody's already doing it, right?
Right.
Everybody's already in leadership cultures. The question is, are we aware of it? Are we conscious of it? Do we know that it's happening? Well, yeah, we sort of do. We sort of know that we have code language and that we have some shared beliefs. But it's not until we start to talk about what those shared beliefs are that we can actually start to change our behaviors or our practices. Beliefs drive practices, and repeated practices are best practices, or worst. Or worst. They can become our own worst enemy when we're facing change and can't quite get around that corner. So it's a good lever, and it's a good way to be able to master change leadership through the leadership culture itself.
So one thing as you were talking that I got really curious about is your perspective on something that I know we both see in our work, which is this key piece around beliefs, right? And you said this so clearly: people don't want to change their behavior until they've changed their beliefs, right? Because they have these behaviors for a reason, right? They've served the person well. And so we still run into a lot of organizations, though, and leaders that don't necessarily buy into this whole idea of beliefs, right? They don't buy into the power of it. I'm curious, what is your take on that?
Well, particularly at the upper reaches, in the C-suite, at the executive level, at the senior level of leaders, those people have worked very hard and for a very long time, and they've learned some success criteria. They didn't just happen to get where they are without working very hard for it. And what they've learned is to trust their judgment. Mm-hmm. And their judgment is not about your judgment or my judgment. And this thing about beliefs that is a switch for so many senior leaders is that it goes from just my beliefs and trusting my beliefs and practicing, trusting my beliefs and practices, trusting my independence as an individual leader, leadership culture now invites me, in fact, requests me to join with you. So the thing that's really different is now you're saying I got to switch mine. I've got to change my beliefs in the context of you changing yours at the same time, that we have to do this together. That makes me uncomfortable. I don't like that. I've never done that before. I don't have much experience with that. That's not the way I got here. That doesn't match the criteria for my success. So I think that's the individual experience that a lot of individual leaders have, because this whole idea of direction, alignment, commitment, and leadership culture, the development moves from just an individual developing themselves within, right? Mm-hmm. which is mostly my competencies, my skills, which gets me to better behaviors. Now, within the leadership culture, the work is between us. Mm-hmm. So it goes from within to between. And this work of shared beliefs, shared values, shared ideas, new together, that's new territory. And that's usually pretty scary. It creates a certain set of vulnerabilities between people. And that's a hump people have to get over, and an important one.
It sounds like that. In some ways, maybe the primary hump, right? Because I think it is, and I think that very much, in your work around what you call adaptogen, the adaptogen design and all of that design. That's where I believe, as we've discussed it, this comes into play in your model and in your work. I think it's similar. People have to face a future in a different kind of way, together with a shared reality and a shared new set of beliefs. And the only way they can do that is to talk their way through that and to start to test them. Once they start to test them and they work, then some comfort comes. Right, like any other change we make, right? You have to try it out, take it for a test drive.
Exactly.
And see if you can find a way for it to be more comfortable over time and beneficial, right? But this it is change, that people have to make from the individual belief systems to the collective, right? The between.
That's right, and so we do something. I don't want to get ahead of myself, but a little advertisement for later on in the program. We use action development. We do development in the work itself. Mm-hmm. So the people are testing the leadership development in the context of the organizational development, of the development of the work. And for us, the strike point is all about strategy. Mm-hmm. It's about getting the right strategy between and among senior leaders, and then having the capability to implement that strategy. That's the key.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. There's always, everything leads back to business, right? And strategy.
Yes, absolutely.
Moving that needle.
It's all about performance, in the end of the day. We wouldn't be doing this if there wasn't some requirement for a different kind of direction and an alignment for that redirection, and that commitment to that redirection. So it's about strategy. It's about being strategically brilliant as well as culturally brilliant.
Strategically and culturally brilliant. I like that. On that note, we're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about the DAC model and something called vertical leadership culture, which I think is really, really interesting. You are listening to Cultural Brilliance Radio. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
Tune in to The Jen Royster Show, intuitive guidance to inspire your life, each Thursday at 8 a.m. Pacific and 11 a.m. Eastern on TransformationTalkRadio.com. This amazing show is an inspirational hour that will take you on an epic metaphysical journey to discover the spiritual approach to life's greatest challenges. Dr. Jen is an internationally known intuitive counselor, spiritual teacher, and energy healer. Call in for intuitive readings and visit JenRoyster.com for more information.
Do you sometimes feel overwhelmed by your mind? Powerless when it seems to spin in worry circles or bombard you with self-critical thoughts? Do you want to learn how to master your mind and feel more in control of your life? Listen to Dr. Friedman's Empowerment Radio. Shift from confusion to clarity, self-doubt to confidence, and from anxiety to peace and balance. Dr. Friedman and his many guest experts share the insights and tools you want to live with greater ease, joy, and purpose. Tune in to Empowerment Radio every first and third Thursday at 9 a.m. Pacific Time.
On the cutting edge of the new mainstream, Christine Upchurch is passionate about bringing together science, psychology, and spirituality in a way that can be applied to our everyday lives for true transformation. The Christine Upchurch Show, stellar conversations to illuminate your journey, engages some of the most outstanding visionaries on the planet in lively dialogue to inspire you to become that bright light you're meant to be. Join Christine every Friday at 11 a.m. Pacific Time on KKNW, AM 1150, and Transformation Talk Radio.
Hi, everybody. This is Claudette Rowley on Cultural Brilliance Radio. Thanks for joining us. If you're just tuning in right now, my guest today is John McGuire from the Center for Creative Leadership, and he and I are talking about how to transform your leadership culture. So, John, we were just talking about how leaders, right? How you help leaders really switch their beliefs, right, from the individual and the collective. And one of the things this was making me think about was about your DAC model, direction, alignment, and commitment. And you mentioned it, but I think it'd be really interesting for listeners just to hear a bit more about what those three words mean in the model. What are you talking about there?
Surely. Direction is really about the simple question: where are we going as an organization? What does that mean? And from my function to your business unit, does that mean the same thing, or are there some variances? But overall, where are we going? I certainly, strategy is not the same thing. Strategy is a little bit about, how do we get there more than the actual direction we're going. But it really is about, answering fundamental questions like, what business are we in? Or what business did we used to be in, and what kind of business are we shifting to? It's about that kind of direction. Or if it's not a business organization, who do we serve? What are we here for? Mm-hmm. What is our purpose? It's those kinds of fundamental directional signals. Mm-hmm. Alignment is really about, and pick your metaphor. If it's a machine metaphor, is this a well-oiled machine? Are we really aligned? Do all the parts work together? If it's more of an organic, kind of metaphor that you use to think about organizations, how do all these parts work and fit together? What sort of alignment is in place, and what key alignment is missing? I always think about, because I've been a businessman and been in business organizations for a good part of my work life, I always think of the supply chain. I always think of the value chain. Mm-hmm. Organizations exist in order to get supplies, products, and services to their customers, to their clients. Mm-hmm. And that can be any kind of organization, tangible and non-tangible products and services. But in order to do that, there has to be groups of people working together across this supply chain, across lots of boundaries, using lots of different kinds of handoffs and connectivity, connecting, to producers and suppliers as well. And alignment is about how well aligned are we in order to get these products and services to market, essentially. And that can be everything from, long-term R&D, the kind of research that we need, to people in the accounting department making sure that bricks and mortar, are in place for our standard business practices. So that's a big piece of work to do, and for a lot of moving parts across an entire enterprise. Mm-hmm. Commitment's really pretty simple. in my view. It's are we in? Are we all in? It's not, do we all understand perfectly? Nope, that you're almost never going to get there. It's, are we in?
Right.
That makes sense.
Yeah, it absolutely does. And thanks for articulating that, because I think it's really helpful to hear, right? I mean,
Sure.
So many organizations, and we've both seen this, right? Are either have one of these down or none of them down, or maybe two of them, right? But to get all three is where
yes.
you're hitting pay dirt, so to speak, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. The team of us that created this framework of leadership culture as the operating system for direction, alignment, and commitment. We heard a lot, particularly in the initial period, we heard a lot about, do we have enough DAC? And that's an interesting question. I think it's an important one. The question that I think is a little bit more important is, do we have the right kind of DAC?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
For our strategy? Do we have the right kind of DAC for the industry that we're in? Do we have the right kind of DAC for our competitive environment? Do we have the right kind to not only be in our market and with our clients and constituents today, but anticipating the ones for tomorrow as well?
Mm-hmm.
And that's all about the kind of leadership culture we have, because that's where the capability lies.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, one of the other things you talk about in the book, and I know in a lot of your work, is vertical leadership culture. Right?
Yes, Yes, that's a very important dimension to us, and the reason is because of this match between and this synergy between strategy and culture. All our work is about getting strategy and culture right together. And in a synergistic way, and to get the teams working together on strategy and culture. And here's why. When I moved into this field from business, what I had seen over and over again in the business world, and then continued to see, was organizations that created pretty good, pretty smart strategies that were required for their future markets that they could not implement.
Mm-hmm.
Let me say that a slightly different way. I've seen lots of organizations that create strategies for products, strategies for services, strategies as differentiators against competition, but they don't have the capability to actually bring those things to market. So we started looking. Right. So we started looking at that, trying to figure out what's going on here. And here's what we found through our action science, our action research. All of our research work has been with clients, has been trying to figure out how to increase the probability of success for clients designed around leadership culture and DAC. And what we found was that over and over and over again, we found organizations that had strategies that required a certain level of interdependence, a certain level of collaboration, a certain level of fluidity of working across these boundaries in the supply chain. And they were stuck with either these more independent, random, achiever-oriented organizations that, they worked very well in the business unit, or they worked very well in the function, but they didn't work together across the enterprise. Or we found even older sort of models of leadership cultures that were just, really hierarchical, very conformer-based. Mm-hmm. And so we came to a conclusion that this century that we're living in, and the level of complexity that's been driven by globalization and technology, is that almost every organization we find needs some level of interdependence, and most of them don't know how to do it yet.
Absolutely. And I think that the piece you mentioned about, if a strategy requires any sort of collaboration, fluidity, right, a different kind of communication, that it couldn't get implemented, right, because there was either not the right mindset or the right behavior, right, the right skills.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, it is such an important piece to all of this, I think, because I find it's often missing. It's a blind
spot. So we're back. So we're back to beliefs again, right?
Right.
And if all our success criteria is our belief that our business unit can be successful on its own, and we don't really have to play well with the other business units or necessarily the functions, or same with the function, which we find, endemic in lots of organizations across the globe. It's just it's a matter of sort of mindset maturity that, and I'll say this, particularly in the West where we like the old style, the old definition of leadership, which we call the tripod, which is the leader, the follower, and the goal, right? That worked for a long time, but my wand, my magic, what happened? It doesn't work as well as it used to, and so that achiever or that conformer kind of leadership culture doesn't quite have what it takes when the collaborator mindset is needed.
It doesn't. It's a whole other skill set, right? It's a completely different mindset. Yeah,
that's right. It's a good way to put it. It's a whole other skill set, and so I think a lot of our work is about helping to develop these skill sets and mindsets into and the biggest distinction, the way we think about this, all of our work is based on constructive development theory. It's based on the theory of stages of adult development. Everybody that has kids believes that their kids go through stages. And when we ask senior leaders, across conferences and across client blocks and in the work of working with all these leaders, everybody believes that there are stages of adult development too. Nobody has a problem with that. They just haven't, and we haven't yet applied that adult development theory and practice into these teams in order to get to that more interdependent work. It is something that has to be earned, and so that's the work that we're at.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that we're talking about this. When we think about vertical leadership culture, right? And I know in our conversation we had earlier today, you talked also about it in terms of that there's almost a hierarchy. I don't know if that's the right word of the culture, right? As you're thinking about that.
Yeah.
Leaders at the very top and the C-suite on down. Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit more about it?
Yeah, I think I may have said it before. There is a hierarchy of culture, and each successive level of culture, is more capable of dealing with more complexity and more uncertainty and more ambiguity, et cetera, et cetera. Here's the way we often think about it. It's not as though, to deal with this collaboration and the interdependence in a supply chain, it's not as though you move from being a good achiever and now you're a good collaborator and you don't need that achiever anymore. You absolutely need the achiever. You need every step and stage that you have along the way. It's just another capability that you add to your range. I often think about this as a pitcher in professional baseball. Nobody in their right mind would say, well, I'm a good pitcher, I only need 2 pitches. I don't want 2 more. Everybody would want more range. And that's what we're talking about here. When we talk about vertical leadership and vertical leadership culture, we're talking about instilling in leaders and leadership as teams more range.
Yeah, and
they can run up. They can run up and down, right? They can be independent. They can be achiever. They can be, standardized and conformer. They already know how to do that. But it gives them the entire range that's required for complexity to deal with these complex strategies and marketplaces.
Yeah. And I think that is certainly, especially in 2019, right? Dealing with complexity.
Especially in 2019.
Right.
It doesn't seem to be lightening up at all, does it, Claudette?
No, it certainly doesn't. So we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, John and I are going to, we're going to move into talking about 1 or 2 cases to start to bring some of this, and I was going to say to life, but I think we've been bringing it to life, John, really, but to give some specificity.
Good.
And John can talk about some of the things that people he's worked with and what he and his colleagues have uncovered. You were listening to Cultural Brilliance Radio. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
Has your buzz for life buzzed off? Feeling ignored, invisible, and wondering if this is really all there is? The years go by faster as we gain momentum. You're halfway there. Are you gathering speed or puttering out? Hit your stride for the liberating half of life. Comfortable in your skin? You can do better than that. Tune in to Discovering You Again Radio every fourth Wednesday at 11 a.m. Pacific as host Susan Axelrod encourages listeners to decide what they want, get inspired to action, and face challenges head on. Host Susan Axelrod pulls no punches, encouraging you to grab the brass ring and soar. For more information about Susan, go to www.whatwillyourlegacybe.com.
High-frequency healing for an amazing life with Source Light Radio. Join host Laura Barton each month on Transformation Talk Radio as she explores Source Light integration, a unique spectrum of energy, light, and frequency. Experience instantaneous healing and amazing shifts in consciousness with Source Light Integrations Radio. For more information on Laura and her work, visit sourcelightintegrations.com.
We're back on Cultural Brilliance Radio. I'm Claudette Rowley here with my guest today, John McGuire from the Center for Creative Leadership, and we are talking about transforming your leadership culture. So, John, before I know we're going to talk about a case that a client you worked with. Before we do that, though, for folks who are interested in learning more about you and your book, what is the best way for them to find out more?
Well, I think I think to jump on to the net and look up transforming your leadership culture, you're going to see the book offered. You're going to see several points of view of the people who have read the book and some reviews. You can also Google us here at the Center for Creative Leadership, and you'll find a number of links to a number of the articles that we've written and white papers. Look for John B. McGuire, and Chuck J. Paulus as authors, and also feel free to email me at any time at McGuireJ@ccl.org.
Oh, great! Thank you so much.
Certainly.
Yeah. So, a case, right? A client. Yeah. Yes, I think that people are sometimes interested in, well, vertical sounds interesting, but what the heck does that mean? How does that work? It's very interesting how beliefs get uncovered when you start to look at this idea of vertical. But we had, and if it's all right with you, I might even touch on two different clients, two different cases. Oh, that's great.
To illustrate the same thing. We worked with a global organization in the Americas. I'll just call them Elevators, Inc. They're a big industrial global organization that installs escalators and elevators. And we did a lot of work with them over a period of time. They were really sailing along, doing very, very well, and had started to change their beliefs and change their practices, and were moving into being very successful in industry leadership in 5 different categories, such as safety that they had. And one day we were talking about competition and the nature of competition. These are all good, Midwestern, Chicago, Detroit, folks. They love their football. They love their football teams and love their teams and their competition. And what came out, which was a big surprise to them, was that while they had been focused so strongly on beating the competition, externally, and focused so strongly on their belief shift towards more interdependent and more customer-oriented kinds of belief systems, they discovered that they loved internal competition, that they loved to compete with each other. And for example, the Western region loved to compete with the Central region. And the two vice presidents were very, very good performers. But they found that some of that it surprised them that they now had these competing beliefs between, competing with each other internally and competing with their big competition on a global scale, and that both of those things were going on. What they found in that was what's so interesting about it, and that is that in their internal competition, that's sort of either you win or I win, right? I mean, if I'm committed to that, I want to beat you, and that's an either or kind of mindset. But when they were competing externally with, let's say, Otis Elevators, a big global company, when they're competing at that level, then what's required in their belief system is a both and. You and I are both committed to beating those guys out there. And therefore, we're not in an argument with each other. We're not in a conflict with each other. There's no either or. It's both and. We're going to have conversations. We're going to open up dialogues. We're going to problem solve. We're going to start to understand, what real dilemmas and paradoxes are, where the problems are just too complex. We can't solve them, but we have to manage them. And the only way we can do that is to do that together. And that kind of both and thinking became hugely important to them. And they used language like both and. And if I can just quickly hit the semicolon and move to another example.
Yeah.
We worked with Canadian Lime, a big international company that wanted to go global. And they had asked us to help them with their strategy, in which they had a goal of expanding their business by $2 billion by going global. And so in that work with them, we have a key workshop, which is sort of a go, no go, or, are you really up to doing this kind of deep work that's required, this belief work? And two of the vice presidents got into their 10-year argument. They had this ritualized argument. And one was absolutely clear that he was right, that they needed to centralize operations. And the other was absolutely clear that they needed to decentralize operations. And these two guys had literally been having this argument for 10 years.
Wow.
And they had moved, some more centralization, some more decentralization over those 10 years, and had never stopped the argument. We challenged them. We gave them a map of interdependence, a couple of dialogue rules, and sent them out of the room for an hour and said, you will stop having this either or argument. You will spend the next hour having a both and conversation in which you're only allowed to ask questions, make observations, and have reflections. You don't get to advocate for anything. So you guys go off. They came back 45 minutes later. They had this huge breakthrough. They were laughing. They were having a really great time. And they said, we've been arguing for 10 years. And the answer is, of course, yes, it's both. It's a dilemma. It's a paradox. It's a polarity. Look how silly we've been. we have to manage this going forward. So there was another example of, very senior, very sophisticated, very mature people who are, executive vice presidents and senior vice presidents of major global companies, who are learning that both and thinking and both and mindsets are a requirement for their companies to advance.
Yeah, I thank you for those are great examples of how, back to beliefs, right? How a shift in mindset changes everything.
That's it.
Yeah.
That's it. And you have to be with these clients and live in their work and live in their organizations and get close enough, to the work and the dilemmas and the paradoxes that they're dealing with in order to both support them and challenge them at the same time to have these conversations. In the elevator company, the CEO of that organization did some marketing work with us, and close to the end of the WebEx, he said, and this was unsolicited, he said, it's a little bit embarrassing to say this, but the reason that CCL has been so useful to us is that we didn't know how to have a conversation with each other. Mm-hmm. They've taught us how to dialogue, and they've taught us how to both have conversations and argue. They've taught us how to let that flow. But most importantly, is that instead of Harvey or Susan winning the argument, the best ideas now win.
Yeah, that says it all, doesn't it? The best ideas now win.
Yeah, and
the person holding their position. Right, and winning out.
Yeah. And another phrase that came out of this work was, it generates multiple right answers. Mm-hmm. There's not just one good answer. There's multiple right answers. And then if we can, put those together in a way that we can start implementing, now we're onto something. Mm-hmm. Now our beliefs are shifting and our practices are changing simultaneously. In the work. Now we're really doing innovation, not talking about it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now we're doing change management and change leadership. And it's surprisingly simple sometimes when the breakthroughs happen at the C-suite level.
It reminds me of a company I'm doing some work with now, and I'm working with the leaders, but also at different levels of the organization. And one of the things that's been striking me about this organization is, because we've already done a lot of work in the culture and systems and leadership and lots of different fundamental pieces, is that some of the issues they're having right now, I look at it and I think, if this person and this person had a 5-minute conversation, a 10-minute conversation, they would resolve this. I can see that it's a quick, right? It's not even a deep belief-based thing. It's more of a operational, right?
Right. Yes.
And so it's fascinating. And still there's this, I'm actually going to be talking with them about this over the next couple of weeks about, this is my observation. What would it take for you to reach out and say, so Sue, could we set up a time to speak this week for 15 minutes? Right.
Yes.
And just resolve this handoff issue, right? Operationally. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Not everything's a paradox or a complexity. So much of this is just as we said, our whole DAC model, our leadership culture model, and the way in which this is all relational. People have to talk to each other.
Right.
Across these boundaries. I mean, there's nothing, somebody said one time that we spent 100 years structuring and organizing businesses into divisions, and now we wonder why we're all divided. Right. And so, it's access. It's structuring in the time to talk and communicate and problem solve and develop into any change work, and that's not in a division. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. We're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, let's touch back on that, because I think this is a really interesting point around, it's not in a division. It's not part of the work I'm supposed to get done. Yet without this kind of dialogue, right, not much actually happens that works well. So we're going to touch back on that when we come after the break. So you are listening to Cultural Brilliance Radio. I'm Claudette Rowley. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
Did you know that all of the shows on the Transformation Radio Network are available as podcasts to stream or download?
Really?
Check us out. Go to transformationradio.fm. We have business shows, spiritual shows, energy healing shows, and pretty much everything in between. Something for everyone, guaranteed to inspire, educate, and transform. We are transforming the world, one listener at a time.
Sometimes being human has its challenges. Our physical health falters, our spirits sag, our dreams don't immediately come to fruition. Welcome to the power of Maximum Medicine Radio. Join me, Doc Martin, in conversations that will blow your mind about healing. In our hit show, Doc Martin addresses the scientific with bridging to the mystical approaches to give you a new narrative about maximum medicine. In this live
Welcome back, everybody, to Cultural Brilliance Radio. I'm Claudette Rowley here with John McGuire, and we're talking about transforming your leadership culture. So, John, before we went to the break, this concept of real communication or real conversation isn't on anybody's job responsibility list, is it? In most organizations, it doesn't fit into a division. Yet it's the thing that to me it's the grease that makes the machine work. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. It's the wine in the conversation, right?
Right. Yeah.
It's the oil of conversation. I love the metaphor. Yes, there's so much to be said for the necessity of being able to have conversations and also the difficult conversations. I think some of our best research, in some ways our best research project, interaction, science, action, research work is something that we call the culture development cycle, and something that we refined to call public learning. And the finding that we had was that when organizations or senior leaders are struggling with difficult change, that those who can have the conversation, in a public way, where they face some personal risk and some vulnerability and are able to talk about mistakes and come clean with what's actually going on around here, are the ones who have an increased probability for successful change. Those who cannot do it are going to fail. Mm-hmm. That's our findings to date.
Yeah. And that makes so much sense to me. It's actually really logical, hearing you talk about it that way. And it strikes me, I will often hear organizations say things like, these are real quotes. We don't have time to solve problems. And I'm like, wait a minute. Listen to that sentence, right? That if you're not solving a problem,
right.
It's a small, especially when it's small, we all know what's going to happen. It's going to get 10 times bigger over time.
Surely.
Yeah. So that's, we don't have time to communicate. We really don't have time to meet and debrief. And those are, I know, belief-driven statements.
They are, and Claudette, we've talked about this before. It's also that people claim they're communicating because they sent the email.
Right.
And so, there's a difference between just communication and actually having the conversation. And some of our clients called it slowing down to power up.
Yeah.
That they found it necessary, that they had to be able to have the strategic conversation in order to do the tactical operational stuff well, because they were just doing the wrong things over and over again. Mm-hmm. For ever since I was doing change management, in a Fortune 50 company, the failure rates of enterprise organizational change have been about 75%.
Right.
3 and 4, organizational change efforts just don't succeed. And we think, and I know you believe with the cultural brilliance work, that this route at least improves the probability of success.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It does, and people learn, right? People learn, they grow, they evolve, and something changes.
Yeah, the whole point of this is the whole learning movement over the last 20 years, organizational learning movement is we're practicing that. Mm-hmm. We're figuring out methodologies for how to make that work. In some ways it's as old as Plato and Socrates. In some ways it's as new as Joan Rivers. Can we talk?
Right.
And the newest and best experiments with this are that often senior leaders feel it is such a relief once they start to practice it, once they start to practice dialogue, once they start to practice the conversation. Mm-hmm. It's like, why haven't we been doing this all the way along? And it's often because, as the CEO that I quoted before, people just don't know how. It's not in the mindset of the way we've practiced organizations until more recently.
No, it was more command and control, right? Hierarchy, do what you've been asked to do, right? Yeah.
Or independent heroes out there just making it happen,
Right.
And sort of more hub and spoke. I mean, you got a lot of independent heroes that can work, and it can work really very well. And there's no reason for it to not work until it doesn't work anymore.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And then
nothing inherently wrong with it. Exactly.
And then and then we need something else. We need something more advanced. As the world is advancing, we need to stay up with it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. What are you seeing in that? And we know that shift can be really challenging. And what are you seeing out there on the horizon?
Well, I'm seeing more and more experiments. Mm-hmm. We met each other based on these common experiments that we're having, and I think there's growth in that arena. That there more and more vertical is becoming in our experience. We've been practicing it at a culture level. Only Bill Torbert and associates in the GLA organization have been practicing it in the way that we have, for a long time. I believe that that's expanding. I believe more of that's happening, and I think that we're seeing, as more and more generations are moving into the executive rank, and I think you've seen that too, that there's more openness to this way of managing, more through a leadership culture.
Right.
I think. Right. I mean, it's less mechanical and more organic. Mm-hmm. People are understanding. Well, of course, you have to manage operations, technology at the same time you're managing, leadership and the organization. Of course, it's both and at all these junctures.
One thing that's striking me as you're talking is this, even with this organic leadership, the both and the different changes, right? That we're all seeing, it's the importance of consciousness around, even if you're in an organically have created a both and culture, which is great, but being aware that you've done it, right? Having that intentionality around what you're doing seems to be really key right now. Yeah.
Absolutely. You and I have done a fair amount of speaking at conferences, and my favorite question with a room full of executives is to ask them how many decisions they made yesterday. Mm-hmm. How many decisions do you make in a day? And it gets laughs, and people say hundreds, and people say dozens, and people enjoy just the question at all. And then I ask, and how many were you conscious about that you made yesterday? Mm-hmm. And they laugh even more because the immediate message is, gosh, most of my decisions are unconscious because I'm really good at it. I'm right.
Mm-hmm.
But also the lesson is, well, if you need to be conscious of your decision because you need a new belief in order to change your decision, change the practice, that's the key. And it really gets their attention. It's like, yeah, I'm not conscious enough about what's going on around. I'm on autopilot. I'm so busy. I got a million things to do. And I get caught into this rut of trusting my beliefs and practices without seeing the need to change.
Right, without stepping outside of them and trying to look in.
Correct.
What do I see here?
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. And if I'm not more conscious, I'm not going to be thinking that way.
Right. I'm just going to keep going.
So, yeah, I mean, I'm just sharing that story with you because I think executives want to do that. They're trying to do that. You know, they're searching for ways to do that. They find it funny in themselves that they're not doing that enough when they see how often they're on autopilot. You know, making the same old decision. Why? Because it's worked for so long. That's why. And it's
easier, right?
It is.
In business and complexity, it's easier to rely on what's worked.
It is, but they also see, you know, IBM did a study within the decade that basically said things are changing and coming at us so fast that the main thing that's required is being conscious.
Yeah, it is. It is, absolutely.
So that's the big challenge. That's the big challenge of not just the future. That's the big challenge of right now. And we're dedicated to assisting these executives. This is not a golden wand. This is not a quick fix. And by the way, I think it's fair to say that this is not necessarily for everybody. You know, I think you have to really be ready to step into this kind of increased consciousness. Don't you think? Isn't that true in your practice, Claudette?
I think that's true. Yeah. I mean, you have to be ready for it. And I've seen cases, it's not for everybody. Absolutely. And I've certainly seen situations where people are ready for part of it and we take that step. And then they get ready for another part of it. We take that step, right? So I've seen that process unfold also.
I think that's a really important point. There are a number of incremental steps in this thing called readiness.
Yeah.
And each one is valuable and each one is worthwhile.
Right. And that I've sometimes seen it go the reverse. Like, unless the organization or the leaders are ready for X, Y, or Z, we're not doing it. I'm like, well, they might be ready for part of it. What if we can, because if we can get part of it, they can help them move the needle on, part A. That may open the door to a whole bunch of other things for them. Yeah. And I think that's
really true. And that can fit with the methodology that has that kind of variability built into it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Because a good methodology for change leadership, across an enterprise is going to have different kinds of change happening in different parts of the supply chain based on what the strategy calls for.
Yeah, it absolutely does. It absolutely does. And John, you're not going to believe this. Our time is up. Our conversation has flown by.
This is too much fun, Claudette.
Too much fun. I want to thank you so much for being on the show and sharing your wisdom and expertise with everybody today. Thank you very much.
It's been a great pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. And thank you to listeners, as always, for being here and tuning in. As always, we had a great time. Please join us the second and fourth Friday of each month at 1 p.m. Eastern, 10 a.m. Pacific. We'll be back here in just a couple of weeks. Until then, stay tuned.
You've been listening to the hit show Cultural Brilliance Radio, the DNA of organizational excellence with Claudette Rowley. Conversations that are transforming the world of culture and business. You can download this podcast and find out more about Claudette and her breakthrough work at ClaudetteRowley.com. Please contact Claudette and find out how you can create a brilliant culture.